Okay, wonderful. So we're going to go ahead and get started today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I'm so excited to dive into this event with our esteemed expert today and fellow Dreamers and Doers member, Cari Rutkoskie, who has 30 years of experience in branding and communications. We're going to learn the best practices to be an effective and engaging communicator. So whether you're managing a team, you're engaging with clients, you're pitching to investors, being an effective communicator is so key to success. And this workshop is going to give you the tools to connect and engage and inspire others with your words. Cari is the president of Words Matter Consulting. She's helped large organizations, mid-sized companies, small businesses, and nonprofits communicate clearly to shape their cultures, attract talent, drive engagement, strengthen brands, and clarify their vision, mission, goals, and strategy. She has over 30 years of brand and communications experience with special expertise in executive and organizational communications and employer branding. She's propelled a leading medical technology company from number 80 to number 11 on Fortune's 100 Best Companies to Work For list and to number 10 on Fortune's World's Best Companies to Work For list. Cari, we are so excited and so grateful to learn from you today. We know how valuable your time is, and we're just so grateful to you for investing in the Dreamers and Doers Collective in this way. With that, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nicole. It's always kind of funny to listen to someone introduce me. I think, how is it possible I've been doing this for 30 years? But here we are. And I appreciate you taking time out of your really busy day. I wanted to just let you know that I'm going to be sharing a lot of communications best practices with you today that probably are most applicable in a business setting, because I tend to, more than anything else, build and lead internal corporate communications functions. However, if that's not you, I still think that I have some tips and tricks to share with you that'll be relevant if your business looks a little bit differently. So I'm going to, at this point, share my deck. And then Nicole, if you can just confirm that you can see it.
Yep, totally.
All right, perfect. And I've got this little preview thing here. Okay. Awesome. So we're going to be talking about up-leveling your communication skills for maximum impact today. And I've broken this down into 12 tips or areas of focus that I think will be helpful to you. So with that, all right, I've got this PDF, Nicole, and I
I
don't
wonder
know
if
how
you
to advance.
scroll down, Cari. I wonder if you
There we
just
go.
scroll.
Yeah,
Yeah, there we
that
go.
works. Perfect. All right. Awesome. Thank you so much. So we're going to start first with audience. So when I say audience, that's the communicator's word for the people that you're communicating with or the people you're talking to. And one of the things that I coach leaders on a lot is to keep in mind when we're communicating effectively, we're thinking about what the audience needs from us as opposed to what we want to tell them. And that maybe seems a little counterintuitive. Often as leaders, we think we have something to say, we have something to share, we have some direction we want to provide, and all of that is good and relevant, but we really maximize our impact with people when we consider why it is that they're showing up and listening to us in the first place. So if we put ourselves in their shoes and think about what it is that we can provide to them when we're talking with them to actually help them be more effective, accomplish their goals, get done what it is that they're focusing on doing right now, we can have a greater impact on them and we can help support them more effectively. So I like to think about what do they need to know from me as opposed to what do I want them to know, which is kind of flipping your whole communications around 180 degrees, the different direction than what we often think about when we're preparing to communicate. There's a acronym that you might have heard before. WIFM is how a lot of people say it. It stands for what's in it for me. So if you put together your communication, you plan your communication thinking about what's in it for me, for the people you're talking with, I think you're going to land more appropriately around communicating effectively with them and getting something from them that they really will find of value. The second tip or best practice is around thinking through communication roles and responsibilities. We often focus on this in the business world when we're planning a project or a program or building a new process or leading a team. Whatever we're working on, we often think about roles and responsibilities in terms of the program or the project or the process. What I'm encouraging you to do is actually think about the communication roles and responsibilities. You may have heard of RACI, Responsible, Accountable, Consult, and Inform. It's an acronym that stands for a way to map roles and responsibilities. Do one for your communications. Why not? Who's responsible for communicating? Who's going to actually share the message? Who's going to write the message? Who's accountable for making sure it gets out? Who's accountable for whatever it is that you're communicating? Is that someone senior to you? Is it you? Is it someone on your team? Is there anything or anyone that we need to consult or inform before we communicate? Is there anyone who needs to weigh in so that we're making sure that we have everyone in alignment around whatever we're communicating before we even start talking? Another way to break this down is another acronym called Lead, Participate, Decide. It's another way just to assign or map roles and responsibilities. I don't think it's incredibly important which tool you use, just that you're thinking about that. Who is communicating? I don't know if this has ever happened with you, but it does happen in larger organizations. And I worked for a Fortune 500 company for 25 years that had, upwards of 20,000 employees. And did this ever happen to you if you were in that situation where you'd hear one thing from one leader and another thing from another leader because they didn't get together and talk about what they were going to communicate before they communicated it? And that's really disconcerting in an organization. You feel like you know what's going on because you heard it here, but then you heard something else or something conflicting over there. Those leaders didn't do the planning before they communicated. Oftentimes in my business, and even when I was in the corporate world, I would have leaders call me and tell me that they had a communication problem that they needed to help me solve. And I'd meet with them and ask them some questions to understand what was really going on. And oftentimes I found that they actually didn't have a communication problem. They actually had a strategy or direction problem. In other words, they didn't know what to communicate because they didn't really know where they were going. I always say that great communication strategy comes from great business strategy. So if it's not clear to me what the business strategy is, that's usually where I start. Let's figure out where we're going as an organization, or what the outcome we want to have related to this project is, or what program outcome we want to have. And once we've nailed that, it's a whole lot easier then to plan our communications from that point forward. The next best practice is to consider dependencies. I think this is especially important in today's world because we are doing so many things at the same time. Have you ever heard the phrase fueling the plane in mid-flight? Or there's a lot of funny little euphemisms that people use around this. But the fact of the matter is that we're not getting less busy within our organizations. We're taking on more and more. We're doing more things with less time. Doesn't it feel like everyone's just super busy when you ask someone, hey, how are you doing? And they say, busy. How are things going? Busy. What do you have going on? Busy. So when we're communicating, we have to keep that in mind, that we're talking to people who aren't singularly focused on whatever it is we're communicating about. They have all kinds of other things that are on their plates that are taking away time and attention. Where are the dependencies or overlaps in what we're talking about and everything else that our audience is focused on? The people we're communicating with have other priorities. How does what we're talking with them about fit into those priorities? It's so important to do that, because if we're asking people to take on a lot or do more, they're probably not going to do it if they're overwhelmed, especially if we haven't been able to tell them what's in it for them or what value will be offered or added to them if they do whatever it is that we're communicating with them about. So consider those dependencies and where the overlaps happen in terms of whatever it is that you're talking about, and it will make a big difference in terms of the understanding that your audience has about what's going on. The next best practice is around making a communications plan. I have an amazing communications plan template. It's pretty simple, it's pretty basic, doesn't need a lot of explanation. If you're interested in that, let me know. I'd be happy to share it with you. The plan basically helps you make a plan for your communication. It's a pretty simple tool. You don't have to use everything in it, but it does really help to think through, what are the key messages? What are the things that I want people to know? What are the takeaways or the keywords or phrases that I want to make sure that we use in the communication? And then thinking about, who do we need to reach? What do we need to tell them? When is that going to happen? In which order is it going to happen? Who's going to be responsible for communicating? Is it in person? Is it an email? Is it text? Is it on social media? How are we going to communicate? So that plan making that plan is critical to communicating effectively. When we're in crisis communications mode, we sometimes call those plans a TikTok, and we break it down minute by minute in order of who needs to know what and when and how we're going to communicate with them. So it's just really a really helpful tool that I've used over the years. Another way to plan for communications that's not quite as formal is a framework called Know, Feel, Do. And I didn't make the Know, Feel, Do framework. It's been around for a long, long time. If you Google it, you can find all kinds of great resources and information about it, videos and so on and so forth. But when I'm working with a new leader who is facing some communications challenges, it's a quick framework that that leader can use to help think through effective communication. And you don't even have to write it down. You can actually just think through it. And the way that it works is you want to first focus on the audience, the person you're communicating with. What do they need to know? What is the information or the facts that I need to share with that person to help them move forward? What are the things I want them to know? The second part of the framework is feel. How do I want this person I'm communicating with to feel? In a business context, that can feel a little strange because we don't often talk about feelings at work, but feelings are what drive behaviors. So if we can identify how we want people to feel from our communication, then we're more likely to actually get them to take action and do what we want them to do. Are we wanting them to feel motivated? Are we want them to feel inspired? Are we wanting them to feel the pressure? Are we wanting them to feel the urgency? There's lots of different feelings that we might want people to experience as we're communicating with them, and thinking through what those feelings might be is critical. And then the third element of Know, Feel, Do is exactly that. What do we want people to do? I don't know about you, but I have sat through so many presentations where leaders provide all this really great information, and then they don't tell me what I'm supposed to do with it. And when we don't tell people what we want them to do, then there's a pretty good chance they're not going to do what we want them to do. They might do something else. Most people will do nothing. So we have to make that really clear. And the list should be short. One thing, maybe two things, maximum three things that we want people to do. And those could be any number of things. I want you to go and talk to your team about what you heard today. I'd like you to go and make an action plan for the next steps in this project. I'd like you to stay focused on our priority to win more business. Whatever those things are, we need to ask people to do those things. And we need to articulate what they are. So Know, Feel, Do is an awesome framework, very informal way to kind of think through and plan your communications. I want to talk a little bit about spokesperson. So this is maybe more on the big business side, but in a time of crisis or big change, when something really emotional is happening, sometimes it feels like we should just have the senior most leader present it, or the leader who made the decision around whatever is happening, communicate around it. And that's not always the best option. I've done a lot of merger and acquisition communications work over the course of my career. And sometimes it maybe makes sense for the new business leader, the acquiring business leader, to come and talk to the recently acquired employees about what's going on. But imagine this, your company has just been acquired and you have a lot of feelings about that. And probably the first person that you want to hear from is not the new leader. Maybe it is. But it might be better to have a more neutral spokesperson carry the message forward. Maybe it's the leader that you currently have, but what if that leader is actually not moving through the acquisition and joining the new company? What if they're actually leaving the organization? Probably not a good choice for spokesperson, because they might say something that you don't want them to say. So in a tricky situation like that, merger and acquisition, big change, whatever it might be, just think through who will be able to convey the message the most effectively to whoever it is that you're talking to, and be able to stick to those key messages that you've identified and that you want them to share. It might not be the obvious choice. There might be a better person to carry the message forward. A few more tricks and tips around planning for communications. I am old school and I've been doing comms for a long, long time, and I still believe that face-to-face communication is the best choice if you can do it. In this highly connected digital world, it's really hard to do. But when you meet with someone face to face, all that nonverbal communication that gets cut off on Zoom at about your chest level, you can see all the rest of it. You can see if someone has their arms crossed, which shows I'm not with you, or their arms and legs crossed, which shows I'm really not with you. You might miss that when you're in a digital communication, and you're certainly going to miss that if you're on the phone. So if you can, especially if the communication is important, I really recommend that you try to do it face to face. It's a great way to build trust and relationships. Phone calls work great. Zoom or any of those digital teams or anything where you can actually see cameras on. I always recommend cameras on if possible, and make that expectation clear that you want a cameras on meeting. I would say that's the next best. Email and texting for me are last resort communications, and here's why. They're very effective in terms of efficiency. I can write an email, I can click send, and out it goes, and I don't have to worry about gathering people together and taking attendance and putting together a PowerPoint deck and all those things. But here's what doesn't happen. When you send an email or when you send a text, you have no idea if the person that you sent it to got it. You have no idea if they read it. You have no idea if they understood it. So you miss a lot in that passive or one-way communication that you benefit from and get from a two-way communication when you're actually talking with someone. So just consider that. I like to use multiple methods and lots of channels when I'm communicating, because not everybody likes to be communicated with in the same way. So I'll take one important message and I will share it in a meeting. I will send it in an email. I will post it on an intranet. I will text it to my team. I will bring it up in another meeting, maybe even do a video. Lots of different channels, same message, lots of different ways of sharing the information. And that way I'm going to increase the possibility that more people get the message, hear the message, understand the message. Less than 50% of people actually read the email that they get. Think about your own behavior. I don't know how many open emails you have in your inbox. I always try to clean through them at the end of every day, but less than 50%, and that number is probably statistically getting lower and lower and lower, actually read their email. So it's just not a good standalone method of communicating. You should always pair email, in my opinion, with some other communication form. Another thing I like to remind people of is that you can't tell people, unfortunately, something just one time and expect them to remember it. It just doesn't work that way. The standard best practice from a communications perspective is to share information with people 7 to 10 times before they actually hear you. So as a leader, if you tell your team something just one time, some of them are going to hear you, but the vast majority will hear it and it's going to go in one ear and right out the other. We have to tell people things over and over and over again. I'm working with a CEO right now who his business is really struggling. He's a contract manufacturer in the medical device space, and it's just really tough. It's tough for his industry right now. And he's like, Cari, what am I missing from a communications perspective? And I said, you know, every time you talk to your people, you give them 3 different focus areas. And so what they experience is that every month you're changing the strategy and the direction of the company. You're not actually, but because you talk about different things every time you talk to them, it feels like you're constantly changing direction. What I recommend that you do instead is pick the 3 things that you want them to focus on. And every time you talk with your team, talk about those 3 things. And you can give them different examples or things that you're doing to drive toward those 3 priorities, but the priorities are the same. And what that feels like then for the people you're talking to, for your team, is that you're on the same track and you're heading in the same direction. And here's all the things that we're doing to move toward that. So if he says it 7 months in a row, all of a sudden people are going to start to click like, oh, I've heard our CEO talk about this now a bunch of times. It must be really important because he keeps talking about it. So just remember, one time isn't going to do it. You're going to need to say things multiple times in order for it to stick with people. And then the last point that I want to make around communication planning is around cascade. So cascading is a really old term. It's been around forever. And the idea is that the person at the top of the organization communicates to the next level down. And then those people communicate with the next level down. And those people communicate with the next level down, and so on and so forth. And so the message trickles through the organization. And this is actually really good methodology, and it still really works today. The good news about cascading is that it allows people to hear information from the person they most want to hear it from, and that's their manager. Most people want to hear important information from the top leaders in the company or their direct manager. Those are the people they trust the most in general. So when you cascade, that's exactly what you're having happen is team members are hearing from their manager or from the top leaders about what's going on. The problem with cascading is that sometimes the cascade breaks. The top person communicates with the next level down. They all hear it, but guess what? Only 3 of those cascade it. And then something breaks in that level down, and then only 2 people hear it, right? And maybe it picks up over on this side and cascades down, but you miss people with the cascade. So I encourage you still to think about cascading messages through your organization and through your team, but follow it up with something else. So a direct communication from you to everybody, an email backup, a post on your intranet, a Slack, a text, whatever it is. So you give the manager an opportunity to communicate directly with the team, but then you make sure that if the manager dropped the ball because they're too busy or forgot or whatever, they still hear the message. All right, so I've been through 4 of the 12, and I want to just pause here really quick to see if there are any questions that have come up so far that I can answer. Nicole, does anyone have anything?
Nothing so far in the chat, but if folks want to chime in either in the chat now or if they want to unmute, we have a great like size group where we can do a little bit of unmuting if folks are comfortable with that and if anybody has any questions.
All right, well, I'm not hearing any, so I'm going to plow on here.
Perfect.
So the next best practice around maximizing the effectiveness of your communications is to establish a drumbeat or a cadence. That's another way to say it. So what I see sometimes in organizations is that leaders come forward and they say some important information and then they disappear. And they're in the background doing all this really great stuff, and they're leading and deciding and driving things forward, but they're not communicating that with their people. And so to the people, it feels like, are the leaders doing anything? Because they're not sharing anything with me and I don't know what's happening. So I really like that regular, consistent cadence and drumbeat. For most of my clients, we still do an email newsletter, and that might sound really old school, but you know what? It's a great way to get information out. For most companies, we do this every 2 to 4 weeks. It usually starts with a message from the top leader of the company, and then it's usually stories directly related to something that's happening in the business that relates directly to the business strategy. That cadence is really good. Town hall meetings, they still are a thing and they still really work. Gathering all the people in your organization together, leaders get a chance to talk about what's happening in the business. I always recommend a Q&A at a town hall meeting or an all hands meeting, some people call them. It's a really effective way of communicating. And I recommend that you do a town hall or an all hands meeting 4 times a year. If you have a largely remote or virtual workforce, record it, make the recording available, or do it on Zoom or Teams and make it live. So if you can show up and ask questions in real time, you can do that. There's lots of different ways to do that, but the drumbeat and the cadence is the important thing. So this way, employees know, team members know, I'm going to hear something, and then I know for sure that in a set period of time, I'm going to hear more. I'm not going to hear just something one time, but I'm going to hear more about it later. There's going to be a follow-up or a loop where I'm going to get an opportunity to hear the next steps. So even if you tell people something like, thanks for coming to the meeting today, I have some important information to share with you. And I'll let you know that there's some work we're going to need to do after this meeting, but I'm going to come back to you in the next 2 to 3 weeks with more information. That's enough, right? You're establishing a cadence in the sense that you're telling people when they'll hear from you next and how you're planning to follow up with them. I want to talk a little bit about why. There's a great guy, Simon Sinek, who has kind of written the book on Start With Why. He has an amazing book. I actually don't recommend that you buy the book because I think his TED Talk is outstanding, and 20 minutes to watch the TED Talk versus a few hours to read the book, you can save a little bit of time. Just go to TED and Google Simon Sinek, Start With Why, and you'll find it. But it's just such great background and information around the why and why it's so important to communicate the why. Let me give you an example. I was working with a company that had decided to shut down one of its plants. That's a big deal. When you're shutting down a plant, you're letting people go, people are losing their jobs, and there's a lot of movement that's going to happen. He called me into his office And he said, so I've decided to shut this plant down, and here's what we're going to do. And he started to walk me through the steps of how he's going to shut this plant down and move the operations to other places for efficiency reasons, and which employees were going to get moved and which were going to lose their jobs, and all this kind of stuff. And I said, hold on, time out. Why are you shutting the plant down? And he said, Cari, that doesn't matter. I'm the leader. I've decided we're going to do this. What? The why is the most important thing. Why are you going to shut the plant down? And when pressed, he was able to actually articulate for me the reasons why he wanted to shut the plant down. And wow, it just made so much more sense when he outlined those reasons for me. So when I helped him put together his communications plan for the plant shutdown, we went back to those whys, the reason why the leader made this decision, and they made a ton of sense. Here's something that's really interesting. When that leader stood up to communicate to that group of people about, unfortunately, we're going to have to shut this plant down. Here's why we did it. And here's what's going to happen next. He did that with so much kindness and compassion that there were actually people who came up to him later and thanked him for the way he handled it. If you are planning really, really well and you tell a great story around the why and the what's happening, and you do that with heart and compassion, it makes such a huge difference for how the team members experience it. Sometimes leaders, when communicating bad news, try to just talk about the sunny side up and what's so great. And I think we're missing something when they do that. When we do that, there's something really validating about being really open and transparent and saying something like, this is one of the hardest talks I've ever had to give. I do not like having to stand up here in front of you and having to say this. And I want you to know that I've spent a lot of time trying to think of another option, but this is the best thing for the business. And I want to make this as positive as possible experience for you as I can, understanding that it's going to be really hard to do that. That kind of openness and transparency is really good. So balancing your desire as a leader to instill hope while still telling the truth and being open and transparent goes a long, long way in building trust with your people. Next, I want to talk about using plain language. I work with lots of smart leaders. They like to use like $25 Scrabble words, if you know what I mean, like really long words. And sometimes I'm listening to them talk and I'm thinking, no one understands what you're saying. It's not because they're not smart. It's because they're almost too smart and they know too much. Leaders have all the information. They know what the strategy and direction of the company is. And so many people that they're talking with don't know all those details. And they use such complex language that it's really hard for people to understand what they're actually saying. So one of the things that I encourage leaders to do is when you're sitting down to write something to your team, write it like you'd say it, and use the most simple, straightforward, short words that you possibly can. I always encourage to keep things succinct, but sometimes it takes more short words to say what we want to say effectively than fewer longer words, if that makes sense. So instead of using some big fancy word, why don't we use a few smaller, shorter words to describe what it is that we're trying to say? It can really, really help. I'm going to go all grammar nerd on you for just a second here. There's a thing in the English language called active voice and passive voice. You've probably heard of it before. Passive voice sounds like this. It has been decided that we're going to shut the plant down. And the problem with passive voice in that sentence is it has been decided by who? Who decided that? It's not clear on who's taking the action. In active voice, it would sound like the leaders decided to shut the plant down. And now it's really clear who decided. Even better if we use a name. Ken decided to shut the plant down. Active voice is powerful. It's not sometimes used in a business context, especially when conveying difficult information, because it squarely puts the decision making, the onus, the action on a person. And sometimes we don't want to do that. But I encourage you to use active voice because it's easier to understand and it's much, much clearer. A few other tips around using plain language. This is a strange phenomenon, but it actually works. Try this next time. When you add a number to a headline or a subject line in an email that you're sending, or a story that you're posting on your intranet, or a blog that you're making on your website, for some reason, numbers and headlines totally work. So 4 ways you can be a better communicator is probably more likely to be read than tips for a better communicator. Right? Something about the number 4. I don't know. It just works. Another thing to think about is using bullets, bold, and subheads to break your content up. 30 years ago, when I started doing corporate communications, we would write pages and pages and pages of just what we would call running copy, right? Just sentence, 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 tons of text, maybe some paragraph breaks. People don't consume information like they used to. We're used to getting it in bite-sized chunks. Digital has really changed how we communicate. So I encourage you to break up your content into bullets as much as you can. Maybe you have an intro sentence and then your points are bulleted out. It makes it easier to read and skim the information. People often skim information these days. Bold the things that you really want to highlight or you want to stand out. Use subheads to kind of break up your text. It just makes it easier for people to skim and scan, which is how most people consume information these days. Say what you know when you know it means that sometimes we wait until we have everything figured out. And by then, the information or the communication we want to have has already leaked. And when I say leak, what I mean is maybe a few people know what's going on, but we haven't yet decided how we want to say it. So we don't say anything. And then somehow the information gets out and gets shared, kind of water cooler talk or the grapevine. There's lots of different words for that. Sometimes it can be better to not completely figure everything out and just communicate proactively as soon as you know when something is happening. To be as open and transparent as you can is so much better than to wait until you've nailed it and perfected the communication and the moment has passed. I'm a huge introvert, and so the more people there are in a room, the more uncomfortable I am. And what I have found is sometimes speaking up in the first 5 minutes ensures that I'll actively participate in the whole meeting. But if I let that first 5 minutes pass by without saying anything, I'm probably going to stay quiet through the whole meeting. It's the same kind of concept, like speak up early and often, and tell people what you know. If you don't have all the answers yet, it's okay to say, I don't know. I'm going to find that out and I'll get back to you by the end of the week or by next Tuesday or whatever it is. I don't think saying I don't know all the time really gives us a lot of credibility, but every once in a while, it's a really open and honest thing to say. Oh, that's a great question, huh? I don't know the answer to that. What do you think? Or, great question. I don't have the answer to that. I'll get back to you next week. I want to talk about storytelling. This is so fun because story has really, it's having a moment, as they say. Everyone seems to be talking about storytelling these days. And I love that because storytelling has been around for as long as humans have had language. We've been telling stories. The fact of the matter is that stories are more easy for people to remember than other kinds of information. So if you can break down whatever it is you're wanting to communicate into a memorable story, it's really going to help your message stick. One of the ways to think about change communication is getting people from here to there. So I'll give you the most basic change communication framework ever. When you want to move an organization or a group or people through change, we talk about here first and what here looks like and how here is not working, the things that are broken and not effective and what we're doing right here and now. And then we paint a picture or a vision for the future. We inspire them in terms of where we're going and how we're going to get there. And then we celebrate every milestone along the way. So we're here now. We take a step forward closer to there, wherever we're going. We look backwards and talk about how far we've come from here. We're here now. We used to be there. And we're going to that awesome point in the future. And if we can tell a story or celebrate that milestone along the way, it's going to help people really see how far we've come along the journey. And I encourage you to celebrate those milestones and share those stories frequently throughout the journey from here to there along the change. If you paint a picture of what it will look like when you get there, it gets people excited. Our job as leaders is to inspire people. That's how we get them to move and change. And so tell a story about what it looks like when things will be better. I have an organization I'm working with right now who is implementing an enterprise resource planning or ERP system, which is going to be hugely disruptive to their business. And it's painstaking. They're literally moving from Excel spreadsheets and homegrown little systems to having this system that will run their whole business. And we keep painting that picture of what it's going to be like when you no longer have 10 spreadsheets to do your stuff, but instead you log in and you have one dashboard with one screen that tells you all that stuff and even more than you have now. And we talk about that all the time. And now that we're starting to build this system, we can actually show them pictures of what those screenshots look like. They're helping us build that system, so they're seeing it as we build it. It helps get them excited. We keep painting that vision, that picture of what it's going to look like when the system is implemented and we've given up all these stupid, time-consuming Excel spreadsheets. All right, next I want to talk about active listening. So I'm doing a ton of talking, but the most effective communication, I think, comes down to listening. And if I were to just make a bold political, semi-political statement, I think so much of the problems that we're experiencing right now is because people aren't taking the time to listen as much as they could, or maybe even should. And listening can really unlock a lot of potential and can take your communications to the next level. I was actually just meeting with a leader this morning who's having a lot of problems with someone on her team. He's just not performing to her level. She's a new leader to him. She used to be a peer and now she's managing him, and he's not meeting expectations, and she keeps having conversations and movement isn't happening. And so what I suggested to her this morning is, why don't, instead of trying to solve the problem, provide direction, inspire him to action, or whatever it is that you've been doing, why don't you just listen? And she said to me, well, how am I supposed to do that? And I said, well, let's ask some open-ended questions. So when you sit down and you talk about what's happening with him, why don't you listen to what he's saying and reflect back what you've heard? And so we just talk through that a little bit. So when we're actively listening, we're asking open-ended questions. An open-ended question requires more than a yes, no, or I don't know response. A closed question, you can only answer with yes, no, I don't know. So the difference would be, do you want pizza for dinner? Possible answers, yes, no, I don't know, as opposed to what would you like for dinner, which is an open-ended question and invites pizza and all kinds of other things. So when we're listening actively, we're asking open-ended questions. We're listening to the answers. We're actually not planning what we're going to say next, but we're listening to what the people are saying. And then we're responding thoughtfully and reflecting back what we heard without judgment. So we're not using any words that show how we're evaluating what they're said. We're just showing them that we've heard them and that we see them and we understood. Two of my favorite phrases, they aren't questions, but ways to respond and reflect back to get someone to continue to talk, are tell me more and say more about that. Those two phrases are like gold. And by the way, if you use this with your partner, your spouse, your children, your parents, whatever, it's like groundbreaking stuff. It doesn't just work at work, it works everywhere. Tell me more about that. That's so interesting. I'm very curious about that. Say more about that. Really, really powerful, positive phrases. When you're asking questions, I have a couple tips. Who, what, where, when, and how questions in general are going to get you more positive feedback and a better listening experience for the person you're communicating with. Why questions tend to put people on the defensive. Let me give you an example. Tell me how you decided that. Just sounds a whole lot different than, why did you do that? So there's just something about those words that hit differently. And so when actively listening, I just recommend kind of limiting the why. I'm a why person myself. And a few tips ago, I just told you to tell people the why. But for some reason, when we ask why, it kind of sets people back on their heels a little bit. Another way to listen actively and kind of reflect back what we've heard is to use an I plus a feeling statement instead of a you plus a statement. So in other words, I was really curious when you said that. Tell me more about that, as opposed to, you sound really pissed off. It hits different, right? Something about using that word you kind of, again, puts people on the defensive. And I love the I plus feeling statement to kind of lead into active listening and being able to continue the conversation. So I could talk about active listening forever. I just think it's such a powerful tool that's underused from a communications perspective. I'm in the home stretch here. I've just got 2 tips left. The first one I'll just hit really briefly here, which is from a communications perspective. I really encourage you to get feedback and measure your communications effectiveness. And early in my career, this was one that kind of, it was harder to do. And what I found is that feedback and measurement of communications feels and sounds soft, but it doesn't have to be. So one way of doing that to get feedback and measure your communications is quantitatively through surveys, just a little pulse survey. In other words, a 1, 2, or 3 question survey that you send out regularly, great feedback, or just qualitative feedback. Pick up the phone and call somebody and say, hey, what are you hearing people talk about? By the way, if you call someone and you say, hey, what do you think about? You're less likely to get great information than if you call someone and say, hey, what are you hearing people talk about? When we ask, what are you hearing people talk about instead of what do you think? We're giving people permission to pass along what they think in a way that sounds like it didn't come directly from them. And so they can kind of protect themselves a little bit. I always get more feedback when I say, hey, tell me what people are talking about instead of, hey, what do you think? It helps keep the conversations going. And then last but not least, kind of a recap of something that I shared earlier, just around sharing successes. Sometimes we wait to celebrate when the story is really big, right? Like we've hit some major milestone or we've finished the project. If we're waiting to celebrate or tell stories around what we're doing until we've gotten to the end, we've missed a whole lot of opportunities along the way to share successes. So I think it's just really important to keep talking about every little step forward, and nothing is too small. One of the things that I insist on with my clients is to tell stories about people instead of processes, projects, things, and stuff. So just earlier today, I was on the phone with a few engineers at a company, and one of their suppliers discontinued one of their products that they need to make something for their customers. And so they had to go find a replacement product. And so we're going to tell this story to the organization about how these 3 engineers came together and solved this problem. And the way that we're going to tell the story is not about the powder, the product that they can no longer get. Instead, we're going to talk about the 3 engineers and how they solved the problem of having the powder discontinued, and how they found another replacement powder that they needed to run their business, because they're the heroes of the story. They're the ones who solved the problem. They are the ones who are making this work for the company. And so we're going to shine the spotlight on people. So I encourage you to do that. Instead of doing boring meeting recaps, we got together and we talked about this. Instead, hey, Mike had this great idea and it helped unlock this potential innovation in the company. Sarah did this amazing thing and it inspired people to great action. So telling stories about people instead of all the other businessy kinds of things almost always has more success. So those are my tips, tricks of how to level up your communications. And with that, I think we have a few minutes left if anyone has any questions for me.
And I think we can do questions too. We can do questions in the chat. We can do questions unmuted too, because we have a group that makes that doable today. Let's see. Monica just chatted in. Thank you so much. Thanks, Monica. Amazing. Okay. Well, I'll give everybody a minute or two. And please, if you're formulating your questions, feel free to interrupt me. Feel free to write them into the chat. But I just want to thank everybody for joining today. But Cari, thank you so much for all of the way. This is such a jam-packed session full of so much wisdom. And it was so helpful and so tactical and actionable. And so thank you for just taking the time out to share from all of your wealth of experience. So cool. I can't wait I'm so happy for those who got a chance to view this live today, but I'm also excited for all those who I know are going to be watching this as a recorded event in the future. So thank you for taking the time to do that.
My pleasure.
Thank you everybody for coming. If you have, and Cari, if anybody has questions for you, is there a best way that folks can get in touch with you?
Sure, you can use my Dreamers and Doers, the Dreamers and Doers platform, right? I'll get a notification and go right on and answer the question there. And that's probably the best way to reach me. I'd give my email address, but it's really long. So just use the platform.
Perfect. That's exactly why we have it. It's a perfect plan. Wonderful. Well, I will let everybody go, but thank you all for joining. Thank you again, Cari. We appreciate you so much. I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your week and weekend shortly ahead.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.